The Young and the Restless Thurdays, full April to 2006. Nothing in Genoa City stays buried for long. But the most dangerous truths are never the ones revealed in a boardroom or screamed across a mansion foyer. The most dangerous truths are the ones that arrive quietly, through a doctor's careful expression, through a child's changed behavior, through the silence between two people who once believed love alone could survive anything. That is why this latest turn feels so explosive. It is not just another crisis stacked on top of old scandals. It is a chain reaction, one that begins with Dominic and spreads outward through Abby, Devin, Mariah, Tesser, Daniel, Kyle, Claire, Victor, and Jack, until every relationship becomes a battleground. What makes it even more powerful is that nobody involved is facing a simple villain. They are facing consequences, and consequences are always harder to fight because they do not care who meant well. When Devin and Abby first brought Dominic home after everything that had happened, they clung to the smallest signs of normalcy as if those signs could save them. The boy slept, ate, smiled at familiar voices, reached for his toys, and for a brief, fragile stretch of time, that was enough to convince to terrified parents that maybe the nightmare had not carved as deeply into him as they feared. They wanted to believe that children are more resilient than adults, that love and routine and gentle patience could restore what had been shaken. In those early days, Abby especially needed that belief. She had already spent too much of her life watching happiness become unstable the moment she trusted it. If Dominic seemed all right, then perhaps she could hold herself together. If Dominic was still whole, then perhaps she could pretend she was too. But fear that has been forced underground has a way of reappearing in other forms. It comes back in sleepless nights, in sudden crying spells, in a child flinching at closed doors or unfamiliar footsteps, in subtle behavioral shifts that only a mother notices first, because mothers often see danger before anyone else admits it is there. Abby starts catching those moments before Devin does. Dominic wakes up crying harder than before, not the ordinary cries of a tired child, but the panicked, disoriented sobbing of someone whose body remembers fear even when his words cannot express it. He clings more tightly. He startles more easily. He resists being left even for a minute. At first, Abby tells herself she is imagining it because trauma has made her suspicious of everything. Then the pediatric specialist says the words she dreaded hearing. Delayed emotional responses in children are not uncommon, and the real damage sometimes surfaces only after the child is back in a place where he finally feels safe enough to unravel. That moment should hit like a knife, because it confirms the one thing Devin and Abby were desperate not to hear. Dominic did not escape untouched. The crisis is not over. It has simply changed shape. Abby reacts first with denial, then with anger so sharp it feels almost cleansing. Anger is easier than helplessness. Anger gives her a target. Anger lets her stand upright instead of collapsing under the sick guilt that she did not protect her son from the beginning. From that moment on, the issue is no longer abstract. It is no longer about sympathy for Mariah's condition, or about the tragedy of someone spiraling into mental instability, or about family loyalty stretched under pressure. It becomes about a child. And once a child's suffering can be medically named, the moral atmosphere changes completely. Devin feels it too, though his response is colder. Abby burns hot. Devin hardens. He stops speaking about healing and starts speaking about boundaries, legal options, expert opinions, long-term safeguards. A line has been crossed that he cannot intellectually or emotionally uncross. This is what makes the potential development about Mariah's institutional placement so explosive. If Abby learns that Mariah is not going to prison, but is instead being sent to a psychiatric facility or long-term care program, her reaction will not be measured. It cannot be. In Abby's eyes, this will look less like justice and more like the system politely explaining why her son's pain must be handled delicately because the adult who caused it is suffering too. And while that may be medically and morally nuanced, nuance is often the first casualty of parental terror. Abby will hear only one thing: Dominic is paying a price, and Mariah is being spared the kind of punishment Abby feels in her bones she deserves. That fury is not entirely fair, but it is profoundly believable. If anything, it would make Abby more compelling, not less. Soap stories become unforgettable when righteous pain turns into morally dangerous certainty, and Abby has every reason to become certain that mercy for Mariah is betrayal toward Dominic. Devin, despite being more controlled, would likely not be far behind. He has always been a man who tries to reason through emotional disaster, but the mention of Dominic's lingering trauma will unlock something darker in him. He will remember every second of fear, every hour of not knowing, every awful possibility that kept growing in his head while his son was gone. He may tell himself that treatment is appropriate, that prison is not the only form of accountability, but his emotional reality will be harsher. He will feel that Mariah crossed into territory where intentions stopped mattering, and that is the terrible brilliance of this arc. Mariah's mental state can be real, tragic, and deserving of care, while Devin and Abby's rage can also be real, tragic, and deserved. Both truths can coexist, and because they do, the conflict becomes richer, more painful, more impossible to solve cleanly. Mariah herself becomes the center of a different, but equally brutal war. She is no longer simply dealing with what she did, she is dealing with what her actions have become in the lives of others. There is a difference, and it matters. At first, Mariah's collapse was about her own fractured perception, her own distorted instincts, her own inability to separate love from obsession and safety from possession. But once Dominic's suffering begins to show delayed signs, Mariah's guilt will deepen into something close to annihilation. She will not need anyone to accuse her. She will accuse herself with far more cruelty than anyone else could manage. The worst part is that this kind of guilt rarely leads to healthy repentance. It leads to self-erasure. It leads to the belief that everyone would be better off if she simply disappeared from the roles she once occupied: wife, mother, daughter, friend. That is why Tessa's decision becomes so pivotal. It is not just about whether a marriage can survive betrayal. It is about whether love can survive when one person no longer believes she deserves to be loved at all. Tessa did not lose faith in Mariah first. Mariah pushed her away. That detail changes everything. It would be easier, perhaps even cleaner, if Tessa had simply been the wounded spouse stepping back after too much damage. But what makes this storyline unique is that Tessa was willing to stay in the fire. She was willing to show up, to help, to endure the ugliness of treatment and recovery. Mariah was the one who decided she should not. Mariah weaponized distance as punishment, calling it sacrifice, and Tessa has been left to figure out whether honoring that distance is compassionate or cowardly. Tessa's feelings for Daniel make the decision even messier in a way that could be incredibly dramatic if handled with emotional honesty. Daniel is not just a rebound temptation. He represents something lighter, something less hunted, something creative and unexpectedly gentle in a time when Tessa's real life has become an exhausting cycle of pain, waiting, and emotional rejection. Their connection at Crimson Lights, their music, their shared grief, their quiet comfort in each other's company, those things matter precisely because they do not feel scheming. That is why they are dangerous. Affairs born of lust are easy to condemn. Emotional intimacy born of loneliness is harder, because it emerges from real human need. Tessa may not have intended to fall toward Daniel, but when a woman is starved of closeness in her marriage and someone else begins to see her clearly, the heart can drift before the mind catches up. Still, Arya complicates everything in the most tender and painful way. Tessa cannot make this decision as if she were alone. Mariah is not only her estranged wife, she is Arya's other mother. That bond does not vanish because trust has been damaged. And this is where Tessa's conflict becomes devastating. Does she give the marriage another chance because Mariah is recovering and Arya deserves every possible effort at family stability? Or does she finally admit that love built entirely on rescue, guilt, and emotional collapse is not a marriage anymore, but an obligation? From my perspective, The strongest version of this story is not Tessa rushing back or walking away dramatically. It is Tessa standing in the awful middle, wanting to opposite things at once, to protect the family she built and to stop drowning in someone else's pain. That contradiction feels heartbreakingly real. Daniel, meanwhile, would be pulled into territory he likely never intended to enter. His sympathy for Tessa, his creative chemistry with her, his own exhaustion from the chaos surrounding Phyllis and everything else in his orbit could make him more emotionally available than he should be. Danny's music offer, the invitation to Barcelona, the possibility of recording an album and performing in a private club, all of it opens a door into another life, a life where pain is translated into art instead of legal hearings and psychiatric evaluations. For Tessa, that would be tempting beyond words. For Daniel, it would feel like purpose, but purpose can also become escape. If they lean too hard into that shared dream while Mariah is still fighting for her sanity and Abby and Devin are dealing with Dominic's trauma, then what began as comfort could quickly look like betrayal. And perhaps that is exactly where the story should go, not because Tessa is cruel, but because damaged people often reach for the one thing that makes them feel alive again, even when timing makes that reach look merciless. At the same time, Kyle and Claire are pulled into a different, but equally revealing conflict. One that mirrors the older war between Victor and Jack while threatening the next generation with the same poison. Victor's kidnapping of Jack and the grotesque situation with Patty have already left a moral stain that cannot be scrubbed away with rationalizations. Kyle, for all his flaws, will see that clearly. To him, Victor has crossed a line no amount of family loyalty should excuse. What happened to Jack was not business. It was obsession, retaliation, and abuse of power wrapped in the arrogance of a man who has spent too long believing his motives sanctify his methods. Kyle's outrage would not just be about Jack as a father. It would also be about the terrifying realization that Victor's influence always comes with the expectation that everyone else will normalize the unthinkable once the dust settles. Claire's position is harder, and because it is harder, it is more interesting. She may not want to defend what Victor did outright, because on some level she knows it was indefensible. But family loyalty has a way of blurring ethics, especially when someone like Victor is involved. He does not ask for love in a soft way. He pulls it into his orbit through history, protection, fear, gratitude, and the intoxicating promise that he is acting for the good of the family, even when he is clearly destroying other people to do it. Claire may try to frame his actions as desperation, as the ugly expression of a man who believed he was under siege and acted too far. That is how moral compromise begins, not with approval, but with explanation. Kyle will hear explanation as betrayal. He will feel it as proof that Claire, despite everything, still carries Victor's instincts closer to the surface than he hoped. Their argument would not really be about one kidnapping, it would be about the future, about whether Claire is capable of loving someone from the Abbott side without eventually absorbing the Newman family's logic that power excuses brutality. In a way, it is unfair to Claire. She should not have to answer for Victor's sins, but that is the inheritance of powerful families in this town. You do not just inherit money and names, you inherit suspicion. You inherit the burden of proving you are not destined to repeat the ugliest patterns of the people who raised you. I think this is where the story could become especially sharp. Claire should not simply side with Victor or reject him entirely. The richer choice is for her to struggle visibly, to hate what he did, but resent being forced to condemn him publicly to prove her moral worth to Kyle. That would make the conflict more than a simple lover's quarrel. It would become a crisis of identity. Kyle would be demanding clarity. Claire would be demanding room to wrestle with complexity. Both positions are reasonable, and because they are, the damage between them would cut deeper. He wants certainty because what happened to Jack is intolerable. She resists certainty because family does not unravel neatly just because it should. Back with Abby and Devin, the news about Dominic could trigger more than anger. It could trigger a new phase of control in their household. More evaluations, more restrictions, more legal consultations, more conversations about who gets access to Dominic and under what conditions. The home that once symbolized recovery could become a fortress. Abby, especially, may begin to regulate everything: the routines, the visitors, the environment, because when a parent feels powerless once, they often overcorrect in every direction afterward. Devin may support it at first, but there is also room for tension between them if his instinct for long-term healing begins to clash with Abby's need for immediate and absolute protection. Trauma does not unite couples neatly. Sometimes it reveals how differently they define safety. And then there's the question of whether Abby can ever forgive Sharon if she learns Sharon has supported treatment from Ryer rather than harsher punishment. That conflict, too, has potential. Sharon would see the humanity of mental illness. Abby would see the humanity of a child who was terrorized. Both women would be protecting someone vulnerable. Both would judge the other's priorities. That is the kind of emotional collision soap operas do best, when they stop chasing gimmicks and simply let damaged people defend the people they love. Mariah's place in all of this becomes almost unbearably fragile. She has already lost her footing in her marriage. She is in danger of losing her standing in the family. If she learns that Dominic is now showing delayed trauma responses, it may destroy what little hope she still has that one day she can be folded back into the life she shattered. She may stop fighting for absolution altogether, and that would be the real emergency, more dangerous than the legal outcome.